Good evening, everyone. I want to welcome you all here this evening. I want to thank those of you who've joined us here in person. I want to thank all of you who are joining us online for this incredibly important conversation at this incredibly important point in time. American Jewry and the war in Israel. What do we do now? I'm Rabbi Lori Kaufman. I'm the Director of Content and Innovation here at Park Avenue Synagogue, and we're really pleased that you could be with us this evening. In our Torah reading cycle this week, we read Parshat Noach, the story of Noah, perhaps one of the best-known stories in our Torah. It tells the story of God being dissatisfied with the unhappiness, with the greed, with the avarice, with the wickedness on earth, and so deciding to send a flood to start over again. And he invites Noah to build an ark, as most of you know, and Noah and his wife and his 3 sons and their 3 wives go on the ark together with the animals, and they sail off into a flood. And the Torah tells us that the flood is not just rain from above, but the flood waters open from below. I want to focus for a moment on what it must have felt like to be Noah and his wife and their sons and their daughters-in-law in the midst of the flood, with the water pouring down from above, the water pouring up from below, the sheer terror of it all, the waters rising and rising with no idea what will happen next, watching the world as they knew it erode, watching everything that they knew and understood be destroyed. We are in a time of the floodwaters rising. We are flooded by news. We're flooded by stories. We're flooded by images. We're flooded by horror. We are in a time when the floodwaters are rising and rising, and the rain is falling and falling, and it feels like we're going to drown. But I want to remind us that towards the end of the Parsha, even in the midst of the horror and the pain and the uncertainty of it all, Noah is able to hold on to hope. As the waters start to recede, he sends out a raven to look for signs of a better life outside. And the raven doesn't come back. And still Noah holds on to hope. Noah sends out a dove, and the dove comes back with no sign of habitation, with no sign of hope. And still Noah holds on to hope. 7 days later, Noah sends out the dove again. And this time the dove returns with an olive branch in its mouth. The dove and the olive branch are what we use as a sign of peace. I think it's incredible that in this week, while we are drowning in the floodwaters, we're reminded of the signs of peace if we hold on to hope. I think that that's imperative, that even as we know the waters are going to continue to rise, that as Jews, we forget never to hold on to hope, to possibility. Hope, tikva, it's the national anthem of Israel, the hope. So I encourage us all, as we live in this moment of suffering and terror, to please hold on to hope. I want to now invite Hanan Weissman from our partner SAPIR to come and set the stage for this evening's dialogue.
Thank you, Rabbi Kaufman. Simchas Torah, Simchat Torah, is supposed to be the pinnacle of our happiness, the peak of our exuberance. Zaman Simchatenu, we call it, a time of our collective rejoicing. But Simchas Torah 2023 was not that. Not even close. Early in the morning of October 7th, I was startled by a frenetic stream of texts and news alerts and WhatsApp messages. I saw words pierce through the screen of my phone, words like massacre and hostages and unprecedented and war. My wife saw me holding my phone with a strained look on my face. This feels different, I said, not knowing exactly what had transpired. I don't think we've lived through a moment like this. On that morning of October 7th, we did not wake up to Simchas Torah. We woke up to Tisha B'Av. And we woke up to the sudden, ferocious return to our Jewish past. Now, as a kid here in the comfortable embrace of the United States, I grew up learning in school about the horrors of our history, the expulsions, the forced conversions, the massacres, the Cossacks and the Einsatzgruppen, Kishinev, Kristallnacht, Farhud, Jedwabne. Yes, we should never allow awful things that happen to us define our Jewish sense of self. We are far more than the sum of the tragedies that have befallen the Jewish people. But I also often wondered, why is our world so filled with so many words that had to be invented or popularized to describe attacks against Jews? In a 2022 statement last year, President Biden said the Shoah was, quote, a destructive force so unimaginable that it gave rise to an entirely new vocabulary of evil. Words like the Holocaust, genocide, crimes against humanity. There's another word that we could have included. That's the word pogrom. It's a word that was explicitly created to define the violent riots against Jews in Russia and eventually beyond. But here's the thing, and apologies to the actual subject matter experts on this, but if you scan the list of pogroms on Wikipedia, you'll see examples from 1881 and 1906 and 1919 and 1938 and 1941 and 1947, and then it stops. Yes, there were sporadic acts of violence afterwards, but there are no more examples of pogroms. That's in part because in the year 1948, the state of Israel was born. Jews, for the first time in 2,000 years, found a refuge in their ancestral homeland. Pogroms, by and large, became something you read about in a book or learned about in a school, not something you read about in the news or feared might happen in your own town. But that is until 10 days ago, on October 7th, 2023. When thousands of Hamasnikim stormed villages, kibbutzim, and music festivals and committed a litany of horrors so far beyond the pale, you can't help but become immediately transported back to the worst moments in Jewish history. The images, the videos, the stories. I have a list of examples here, but I can't. The hundreds of people taken hostage. But this didn't happen in the Pale settlement. It happened in Israel. And what's the word for a pogrom in Israel? It doesn't exist, because it never happened. But here's the difference between a massacre committed against Jews today and every other time until now. The difference is a former politician from Meretz who, amid the chaos, waited for no one, put on his old uniform, and drove into harm's way to rescue whoever he could find. A journalist asked him to find his son. "Give me his location," he said, "and I will bring him home." The difference is a retired 62-year-old general who, upon hearing that his family was entrapped in a kibbutz, immediately left Tel Aviv with his wife and a handgun, battled members of Hamas, rescued survivors from the music festival, arranged for wounded soldiers to reach a hospital, and after 10 hours, reached his family to the sound of his granddaughter, who simply said, "Saba higia," Grandpa's here. The difference between then and now are the hundreds of thousands of Israeli soldiers who are preparing to defend the land and their people. The difference is the United States deploying the world's largest aircraft carrier to the eastern Mediterranean. It's the delivery of interceptors to replenish the Iron Dome. And it's the unprecedented decision by the President of the United States to travel to Israel in wartime to demonstrate this nation's unwavering support. Or to use the Mama Lashon, the President's going to provide chizuk, strength. Now, everyone in this room, whether in person or on Zoom, have friends and family in the country, and it's very hard not to become engulfed in the anguish and the anxiety, a pent-up fear about what's to come with an impending ground invasion. Make no mistake, The American Jewish community and her friends and allies are a hungry lot. We will continue to provide financial assistance and clothing. We will continue to organize rallies and protests. We will continue to condemn the feckless statements and the absence of statements. Yes, the American Jewish community and her friends and allies are hungry. I'm sure you've seen the scenes, apartments filled with too many cakes, the mountains of duffel bags of supplies sent abroad. In fact, there was such a desire to help from abroad that there was a meme wafting through the web last week that joked, quote, "Soldiers in Gaza are asking Ashkenazim to stop sending food. They already have it hard enough." Last week, I was added to a WhatsApp group called "What Can We Do When Feeling Helpless?" What is there to do? Well, if you hear a conspiracy theory, refute it. If you read about moral equivocation, respond to it, and forcefully. If you see an opportunity to enlighten a friend or a colleague or a neighbor, do it, but not with righteous indignation. Stay educated, stay educated, stay educated. Stay away from unhinged arguments. Always take the moral high ground. Always uphold the laws of war. Shout your support from the digital rooftops. Check on your loved ones here and in Israel. Give generously, but strategically. And wear your Judaism with unabashed pride. 5 days ago, Secretary Blinken stood at the Kiryat in Tel Aviv and said, "The people of Israel have long and rightly prided themselves on their self-reliance, on their ability to defend themselves, even when the odds are stacked against them. The message that I bring to you is this: you may be strong enough on your own to defend yourself, but as long as America exists, you will never, ever have to. We will always be there by your side." But how do we, American citizens, do that? How do American Jewish leaders continue to do that? Religious leaders from the pulpit, educators in the classroom, policy experts from the pages of acclaimed outlets and in the halls of power. It's not an easy set of questions, nor is it an easy time. But that is why we're here today, and why we have an esteemed panel of experts to help us meet the moment and rise to the challenge of this inflection point in history. Bret Stephens is a Pulitzer Prize-winning columnist for the New York Times who has had many illustrious positions, but perhaps none more important than serving as the editor-in-chief of SAPIR, a quarterly journal of ideas for a thriving Jewish future. Dr. Rachel Fish, an educator's educator who's been in the game for 2 decades and recently co-founded a nonprofit think tank, Boundless, to revitalize Israel education and combat Jew hatred. And the moderator for tonight's event, the Mora D'Atra of this synagogue, and the force behind the remarkable effort that raised more than $18 million for the UJA Federation's Israel Emergency Fund, Rabbi Cosgrove. Rabbi Cosgrove, the bima is yours.
Thank you to Hanan, thank you to Rabbi Kaufman. Our partnership with SAPIR is a critical one for our community. It brings national Jewish conversations here, and it's an honor and an ongoing relationship we have. I want to begin not where we said we would begin in our pre-huddle before, but I want to begin with my Shabbat table. It was my daughter's fall break. She had a long weekend, so she had long planned to have all her friends who were also on their fall weekends or at NYU, Sarah Lawrence, or otherwise come. It was supposed to be a festive Shabbat dinner, and it turned into a support group. It was kids coming from this campus, that campus, the other campus, and they felt alone. They felt so very alone, and in the same way that when you come together in grief at a Shiva house or otherwise because no one understands your pain other than those going through it, that was the mood of our Shabbat table. And in all of the outrage, in all of the grief, in all of the analysis of what's going on in the Middle East right now, I did not count on that sorrow, that deep sadness for my daughter, for her friends, and for kids across this country on campus. Rachel, you've committed yourself to this conversation for decades. What has happened in the last 10 days since October 7th? Speak to me about that loneliness, that grief that's taking place in the hearts of our campus kids.
Thank you, Rabbi Cosgrove. Thank you, SAPIR. First of all, this isn't new, and yet it's completely new. And what I mean by that is that what students are feeling today has actually been building and boiling, and a hostile environment has been cultivated on many of these campuses since the period of the 2000s. And even before that, since the period of the 1960s, with a framework of ideological positions and important intellectual factors that have contributed to that hostility. But what happened on October 7th is that our students truly feel alone, abandoned, and marginalized. These are students who have been told that they need to be on the, quote, right side of history. They are students who stand up for every other vulnerable minority. These are students who believe that it is necessary to stand and build bridges between communities, and yet they turn around and they see that they are completely alone. These are students who have been fed a steady diet that there will be a two-state resolution in their lifetime between Israel and a Palestinian leadership. And now they look beside them in their classrooms, they look across the campus quad, and actually they can look straight at some of their faculty members who are standing there deliberately praising Hamas. They are creative. Look how innovative they are. I'm exhilarated to see what Hamas has done. This is not terrorism, this is liberation, this is resistance. Some of them go so far to even say, what are you going to do in order to bring the resistance here? These students go to DEI officers and beg them, truly beg them with tears streaming down their faces and say, listen to their words. They are inciting violence. They want to target us because we are Zionists and target us because we are Jews. Do something. And the majority of them beg, and the pleading falls on deaf ears. These are students, unfortunately, many of them have parents who don't know how to help them. They themselves don't have the language. They don't have the substantive knowledge. They didn't prepare their students to understand how to walk through the world with a tall, strong spine, steeped in their particularism, while understanding their responsibility for universalism. And now, what are their students, their children, supposed to do? This is the world they're living in. This is the world that, unfortunately, we have allowed to be cultivated. We have not done enough. Some of us have been beating this drum for 20 years, and we're told it's not that bad, and these students need thicker skin. The students don't need thicker skin. The grown-ups failed them. The leadership failed them on multiple fronts. The university as the marketplace of ideas failed them. And now we have a real choice. The choice is, how do you reclaim the university? How do you reclaim leadership with moral clarity? And how do you ensure that the next generation of Jews feel that hatikva, that hope, in order to remain deeply committed to the Jewish people?
Bret. Bret, you've come to this bima many times before. You are one of the most strident defenders of free speech. How do we make sense of where is the line between free speech and the glorification of mass murder that Rachel is describing right now? How do we make sense of that?
Well, I believe in free speech, and free speech includes the glorification of mass murder. I just believe in consequences for the people who glorify mass murder. And so I think it is wonderful that people like Bill Ackman and so many others are showing great leadership, because for too long, I think the American Jewish community has been investing in institutions that not only don't have our interests at heart, but are effectively working against our interests. I mean, the University of Pennsylvania has every right to curate any kind of symposia it wants to curate. But donors to that university have every right as well to respond and respond with their place in the institutions and with their pocketbooks. We cannot reclaim some of these institutions. I'm sorry to say, even if your grandkids don't end up, God forbid, at Brown, okay, we need to create new institutions. The rot in institutional life in America is profound. And what we had on October 7th and the days that followed was what I think of as a great exposure of what these places are. And you see these university presidents saying, oh, I'll write a better letter. I'll write a better letter. But ask yourself all about the inputs that went in to the feebleness of that response in the face of the greatest atrocity against Jews since the Holocaust. You know, I've been thinking, Elliot, you know, since October 7th, I've been saying that my rage and my anguish have been in competition within me. I think I'm going to let the rage win. I'm going to let the rage get ahead of me. And it's not simply rage against those demonstrators I saw in Times Square then marching over to 3rd or 2nd Avenue and the Israeli consulate. It's also a rage against all of the minor acts of fellow traveling, which created the environment in which these people are not viewed somehow as every bit as bad, if not, in fact, much worse than the people who marched at Charlottesville 6 years ago in 2017. They are worse because what Hamas had just done is perpetrate not a 9/11, but the equivalent proportionally of 16 9/11s. There are 36 Americans for every Israeli. The losses that Israel sustained on October the 7th are the equivalent of 48,000 American lives. The worst day in American history in terms of the loss of life was at Antietam. That was about 5,000 lives. Israel just lost in a day roughly what America lost over 9 years in the Vietnam War. And what we get are people saying, well, we condemn the violence, but Israel must act with restraint, and Israel must do this, and Israel must do the other. I believe Israel has to act according to the laws of war. It will act according to the laws of war, but the very fact that they're saying it is an outrage. It's an outrage that they are moving with incredible speed from affecting horror at what Hamas did to making demands to Israel about what they can and cannot do. I would love it if these armchair military strategists would tell Israel, oh, you have a right to self-defense, and here's how you're going to use it effectively. They never have answers when it comes to that. So surrounding those Hamasniks, surrounding the 35 or whatever number of groups at Harvard that signed those horrific statements, there is a culture that we have in some ways allowed to flourish and in some cases participated in that is toxic. It is the dirt in which this disease festered. And we have to clean out that dirt. How we do it, I think that is a huge task for the Jewish people going forward. But let's remember, the way in which Jews have operated is that when we've encountered institutions that don't serve our needs, we have created new ones, new and better ones, in banking, in media, in entertainment, in all kinds of walks of life. We've thought, this stinks, let's do it our way. And this is a moment for us to start anew.
I want to follow up, Bret. The fact that we live in a world where the brutality that we've all witnessed on media and Hanan alluded to, murder, rape, hostage taking, is not called out as such, that those who would point out misogyny, I think I read in one of your recent articles, would not condemn rape. Is that, I'm looking through a series of bad options, is that stupidity? Is that evil upon evil? Is that just flat out anti-Semitism that prevents someone from just calling out in rage the brutality that we've all been subjected to this past week?
I choose D, all of the above. and there's a point at which stupidity becomes unforgivable. There's a point at which unthinking prejudice becomes active and harmful prejudice. There's a point at which the double standards to which Israel is constantly applied to Israel become absolutely unforgivable. And they become particularly unforgivable among a supposedly educated class of people who claim they know better or claim to have higher degrees of sensitivity. And this is the problem that we have on American universities today. I know that I do this with some trepidation, but the newspaper to which many of you used to subscribe, my own newspaper, had a superb editorial from Zeke Emanuel in today's paper. You should read it if you hadn't, really calling this into question. Something happened at the universities to make it possible that so many at those universities could act the way they have. And not just the worst of the malefactors, but all of the people who are silent, equivocal, on the fence. How can it be hard at a moment like this to call out, as President Biden did, evil for what it is?
Right. Rachel, your assessment of what's going on campus and broader cultural conversations, these mealy-mouthed statements, the letters, the rewritten letters and otherwise, right? I'm convinced some of them may come from ill will, but some of them may come from university presidents or otherwise who probably couldn't find Israel on a map. And so how do we distinguish between those who are operating out of ignorance and those who are operating out of ill intent?
I think it's hard to do, Rabbi Cosgrove, at this moment in time, because they all have multiple degrees. They all know how to look up where it is on the map. So it's hard for me to accept that they just didn't know. I do think that we are living in a world of moral relativism and moral equivalency and a real lack of moral clarity and moral fortitude. And I hear time and time again, especially now, which is a bit ironic, I think you'll agree, Bret, that, well, university presidents should be neutral. University presidents don't need to make so many political statements. I wonder how many of them felt that way around issues related to gender and sexuality, race, whatever other issue it may have been. No one told them, you need to be neutral right now. They decided that this is the test case for their neutrality. And they want it to be the test case for their neutrality. So is that
just anti-Semitism?
I think they are very uncomfortable with Jews holding power. Jews holding power doesn't fit the paradigm. It's much easier if you have a paradigm in which you're trying to weaken the strong and strengthen the weak. That they get. Jews don't fit that. It's also a challenge for them because when they look at Jewish students on campus, Jewish students, for them, are part of the white majority and not a vulnerable minority. And they don't understand what Jewish students are experiencing and going through. They don't understand that Students for Justice in Palestine, for literally decades, has been framing this rationality that they have created, that has been bought into, and they use an academic veneer very often. How many times did I hear Students for Justice in Palestine leaders, not just last week, not just a year ago, but 20 years ago, quote Frantz Fanon. Do you all read Frantz Fanon? No. There's good reason for that. You may have had to read it once in the university, but Frantz Fanon is a post-colonialist kind of framework that ultimately says anything that has to do with the colonial, evil. And they take this academic veneer and apply it, and these students, many of whom are ill-intentioned, many of whom follow a herd mentality and don't have critical thinking skills, many of whom have learned that the litmus test for how progressive you are on campus is related to the issue of how anti-Israel you are. I'm very particular with my words. I did not say how pro-Palestinian you are. None of them are out there protesting and saying, I'm worried about the innocent Palestinian civilians. They are out there saying, Israelis, those who support Israel, have no right to exist, and that is the starting place. So then it goes back to, this didn't happen yesterday. There is a real rot. And so what do you do over time in order to educate them, sensitize them, help them identify it? Because they can identify Charlottesville, but they can't identify this. And we have to ask ourselves why, and then we have to figure out what do their boards of trustees need in order to be educated so that they can educate their leadership. And it's also the role of the donors, which is why I'm in favor of donors actually saying, if you don't want to take Jewish life seriously, then you don't have to have Jewish money.
By the way, what Rachel said was exactly right. And I would add, I actually believe university presidents should make no statements ever on political matters. The University of Chicago graduate and believer in the values of the Calvin Report. So if your university has practiced platform neutrality and said nothing about it, it is being consistent, and I think it is being principled. But as Larry Summers pointed out absolutely correctly, a university that hangs the Ukrainian flag alongside the American flag, and Lord knows I'm pro-Ukraine, a university that delivered umpteen thousand statements after the murder of George Floyd, that can barely bring itself to say anything after October 7th, simply shouldn't be supported, should be actively opposed. And there are now at this moment all kinds of nascent efforts, and to some extent SAPIR is one of them, all kinds of nascent efforts to create new institutions that are not hostile and inimical to our values and our security and our commitments at home ethically and our political commitments abroad. Support those institutions. Support them. There is financial capital in this room, I suspect. Maybe.
No, there was the other night.
Use it.
Right. So of this buffet of options, right, you can withhold financial support, you can build new institutions that reflect the values we want to see instantiated in this world, you can seek to educate the boards and academically and otherwise of leadership institutions. How do we arm students, Rachel, both in the short term and in the long term? Meaning the kid who is crossing the Columbia campus and is caught flat-footed this week, but also in a more systemic way. What are the things, should there be well-funded people in this room, that we need to have in place short-term and long-term to fight this fight, in addition to what Bret is suggesting?
It comes down to content and courage. Students need to know something. They need to know how to also deliver that message, to whom it should be delivered. Sometimes they're not the right messenger and they need other messengers for that content delivery, but they also need courage. How many students did I talk to this week, Rabbi Cosgrove, who told me in all seriousness, I'm doing everything I can to hide my Jewish identity. I'm tucking in my Magen David. I may not go to Shabbat services. I'm taking off my kippah. Now, of course, there are incredible exceptions to that, and I know those students too, and they're wearing proudly their Jewishness, but also they're doing that not because of the detractors, it's because it's deep inside who they are. Their operating system is one of Jewishness, and they will never deny it. It's how they walk through the world. But they're also doing it to show their fellow Jewish kids, their peers, that they don't have to be so afraid, that there's value in having a gang and having that moral support and that moral courage. I will say this all begins way before students ever walk on a campus quad. And if we are only focused on the campus quad, we are sorely mistaken. First of all, much of this happens now in middle school and high school. public school, independent schools. Don't think it just happens right down up the street at Columbia. It happens in many other places before kids ever leave their parents' home.
I can tell you I have had multiple parents crying in my office this past week, public schools, private schools, that you all send your children to. I'm sorry to interrupt.
No, that's exactly right. And also, now we have superintendents of public schools writing similar letters that are just as bad as the university presidents, but they literally have no model, so we shouldn't be surprised that they don't know how to do it. And on top of that, you're talking about now in terms of Jewish education. For many of our institutions, our Jewish educators who teach the subject of Israel are Israelis. And they don't have the emotional koach at this moment to be able to teach about this. It's too hard. It's too personal. Doesn't mean they can't do it. Some of them are. But that means we need other educators to be able to step up. And it's a combination of that content and courage and really giving that inspiration and sort of an inoculation to say, now you are needed more than ever. And there are a group of us in the field of Israel education who are working to do just that in a collaborative way. But there's a larger issue here, which is about how do you actually build the human capital with the substantive knowledge and the energy and the shared values that we're talking about to teach the next generation in the most significant way where Israel is integrated completely into their Jewish identity and Jewish texts and Jewish education. We have siloed it for far too long. We have said you must learn how to advocate, but you don't actually need to know anything. Talking points don't work because a student will say, wait, it said this, turn page, nothing's on the back. There are no talking points for the horrors that occurred on October 7th. So we have to teach our students the critical thinking skills because what they are engaging and seeing on their phones, they don't know if it's real. They don't know how to respond. They don't know necessarily if the person who's posting that is one of those herd individuals or someone who is actually ill-intentioned. So these are serious long-term issues that have to be addressed and, of course, tend to the immediate needs at the same time.
Thank you. Bret, what's the move of American Jewry right now? Meaning we can raise money, we can do acts of chesed, of kindness, to the degree that Israel is prepared to, but from a political vantage point, just to move a little bit away from the campuses, we're traumatized right now. We shouldn't be paralyzed. What should American Jewry be doing right now?
First of all, we have to not lose our nerve in the next couple of weeks. And there's going to be a great temptation to have a colossal loss of nerve as the battle of images turns less sympathetic to Israel. So this requires us to ask of others not to be moral idiots, not to be the pawns, in effect, of what Hamas is trying to do, which is to turn Palestinian deaths into propaganda victories, which is the game that they have played for ages. It's not to try to use our good consciences or turn our good consciences against the state of Israel. Self-defense does not mean a right, which is the way it's usually described. It's a duty. And a duty is going to require the state of Israel to act much as the United States did in the Second World War. We call the Second World War the Good War, right? Well, the United States did some things in the Good War that were not nice because we understood that nothing good could come if we failed to defeat an evil regime that lay at the basis of the conflict. It's not like the United States reached the Rhine and said, okay, Germany's back to within its old borders, let's stop here. So number one, let's stop playing this game of being guilty moral idiots in the face of a totalitarian regime, not just Hamas, but the people backing Hamas, that aren't just seeking a nice two-state solution, but are seeking the destruction of the Jews. If Hamas could have killed 2 times as many people on October 7th, or 200 times as many people on October 7th, they would have done it. I disagree a little bit with Hanan. My grandfather lived through the pogrom of Kishinev in 1903. They stopped at 44 Jews. Hamas wouldn't have stopped until 7 million Jews were killed if they had had the opportunity. So the desire there is annihilationist. We have to recognize it, and the only response to groups that have annihilationist ambitions is to end those groups. By the way, there's no hope whatsoever for a 2-state solution until we end Hamas as any kind of force in Palestinian politics. And I keep getting back to this, but we have to start better institutions. We have to start better institutions. There are efforts out there. Someone wants to start a university in Austin. I don't know if it's going to succeed, right? But the idea is essentially the right idea. We don't like the media that we are dealing with. Let's start new media institutions. There are efforts out there. They're fledgling efforts, but they're percolating, and some of them are actually succeeding better than others. They're attracting audiences because people feel so profoundly disenchanted with what they get in academia, media, other.
So what would that look like? I mean, like we have Brandeis University, and that's had its own problems. So what would a university look like? Let
me give you just an example. So 10 years ago, I was invited to speak to this college in Pennsylvania I had never heard about. And so I drove out to Allentown and drove up to Muhlenberg College and discovered what I thought was this Lutheran school had this incredibly thriving Jewish life because someone at Muhlenberg some years ago had the bright idea to make the school a good place to be a Jewish student. There are a lot of colleges in America that are about to run into a great deal of trouble because demography is changing in a way that they're going to have much lower enrollments. They don't have the kind of endowments, but they have faculty, they have institutions, they have all of the infrastructure of being colleges. Let's take some of them over. They don't have to be Jewish. No, I'm not kidding. I'm not kidding. If you can take over companies, as some of you do, invest in huge, large sums of money in all kinds of philanthropic efforts, put $300 million to name a school for yourself at Harvard University, put the money instead into a college that you effectively take over, and it doesn't have to be a Jewish university, but it has to be a university that is teaching the kinds of values I learned from people like Leon Kass and Alan Bloom and Nathan Tarkov when I was a student at the University of Chicago, a genuinely liberal education. Create those schools. Roger Hertog once said something to me that stayed with me for years and years. He said, people in business, they take incredible risks in their business lives, and then they become philanthropists, and they're very cautious about how they want to invest their money. Take the same kinds of entrepreneurial risks philanthropically that you were prepared in earlier days to take entrepreneurially. That's something that you can do. And the biggest, I think, to me, the biggest thing that an engaged Jewish community can do is make it possible for every Jewish family to afford a first-class K through 12 education. Nothing better guarantees proud Jewish students.
Thank you. I want to build all the institutions that money can buy, but we're in crisis right now. And so I want to keep the focus on the here and now for a few minutes, and we'll open it up to further questions soon. Because the focus here is on the American context. Biden came out very strong. Please God, if Congress ever gets their act together, the aid will come. This question of what Rachel's describing, what you're describing of the rot, there are moral voices. There are those calling evil, evil, and the actions of the president. How long, what can we do to extend the window here? What do we need to do to keep on the media offensive before the victim is once again thrust into the aggressor posture. What are the moves that we have? Are they legislative? Are they in media? Are they cultural? What are the levers we can pull?
I'll just say one thing and then hand this to you, but we already see that the window is shifting. We saw it today. We saw immediately that major newspapers published information that was inaccurate, didn't bother to wait and verify, and it is very challenging to then reclaim that narrative. That's part of the blood libel. That is ultimately an attempt to smear Israel and Israelis and those who associate with Israel and Israelis. Because then no matter what, you're constantly begging, no, we didn't do this, we didn't do that. And it doesn't matter, because that's what the world sees. That's now the perception. So that window is shifting very quickly. We know that there are communication messaging that needs to get out to a lot of different types of sectors in American society to better understand, not just facts, but have the language, let alone the ability to articulate what they're seeing and make sense of it. Those are efforts that have begun, but we were caught, unprepared. Of course, we need to continue to have some government outreach. It is 100% necessary, particularly knowing that America has hostages, American citizens in Gaza held by Hamas. And so that is part of the participation you hear from Israelis whose families are held hostage. Their stories are front and center. They have been on the media. Many of us are close to those individuals. They have been reaching out to the United States government and others in order to very clearly make that case. But you are not dealing with rational individuals. You are dealing with demented individuals who ultimately seek to harm, to persecute, and maim, and kill as many Jews as possible.
And you're dealing with their apologists here in the West. I want to sort of offer two thoughts that might be a little more optimistic at the risk of disappointing the audience. Something like, the last poll I saw said something like 78% of Americans absolutely stand by and support America's right to self-defense. So what we're really talking, Israel's right to self-defense. So what we're really talking about is a subset of the culture that, for the most part, those of us in this room inhabit, where that is far more contestable. The danger, of course, is that I think culture is trickled down, and that the views of this 18% have a risk of spreading. But we need to be able to capitalize on the good sense of the American people who understand that there's an important difference when it comes to the question of who started it, who's morally culpable, what deaths are deaths due to deliberate acts of murder, and what deaths are tragedies due to collateral mistakes. The American people get it, and the president gets it, and I hope more of the Democratic Party gets it. It was heartening in a sort of way to see even someone like our distinguished Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez walk, this was said ironically, walk back the DSA, the Democratic Socialist America, support for some of the marches, because it shows that as a politician she understands that even that is a precarious position. The second piece of good news is I feel profoundly in my bones that Israel is going to win this war. Israel took a punch in the face because it was expecting a kick in the feet or something else, and this happens in the life of nations. It has happened in the United States on multiple occasions, and it may happen to us again. But Israel has something that few other Western democracies do. It has real and profound social capital. It says everything that the moment those attacks happened, every Israeli living in comfort from LA and San Francisco, in the Bay Area to New York and Boston, was on a flight home to serve. They knew where they were needed. And a country that is able to muster that kind of loyalty even after the divisions of the last year, is fundamentally a healthy nation. Israel is fundamentally a healthy nation.
So
I would just add one other element, which is the two traits you're talking about, resiliency and volunteerism. Meaning Israel is strong, the Jewish people are resilient, there is a level of grit that exists, partly Hanan because of what you outlined, partly because of the joy as well. But there's also this sense that it didn't matter that how many weeks, 36, 38 weeks, this country has been quite divided. Yeah. And immediately, it didn't matter where you were in that division, it was dropped. People figured out quickly how to feed other peoples, how to kosher their kitchen in order to make sure that those who needed the kosher food got the kosher food. They figured out how to take cars down to the south in order to bring people up to the central area of Israel. It didn't matter what their backgrounds were, their political proclivities, their ideological positions, it fell to the wayside. And that's something in terms of sort of the way in which we in the American context have been so deeply steeped in identity politics, haven't been able to rise above. And so we should look to that and think about how to learn from it.
thank you. I'm going to ask one geopolitical question, as it were, and then I'm going to open it up to questions from the community. Bret, let me, so as not to be misquoted, I think the first obligation of any country, especially Israel, is a defense of its citizens. Period, full stop. Not only does Israel need to punch back, not only does Israel need to make sure it's not a return to the status quo, Israel has every right to do what it needs to do. It was clearly caught on its heels by Hamas, however long this attack was being planned. And my fear is that by going into Gaza, as it seems, or if it's already happened, that Israel will once again not only be guilty of, falling into the very steps that Israel's enemies want it to, they've already telescoped this out, but also that there's an overreach where Israel's own goals will not be accomplished. So it's a series of terrible options, but what are the better of the worst options right now that Israel has?
Look, I say this with trepidation because if Israel does advance with a ground assault, it will be bloody. And Israel has a citizen army. So the people who will suffer are the sons and daughters of Israelis who, as united as they are, the death toll for Israel will rise. But Israel exists in the Middle East, and it's a region where weakness is despised and weakness is noticed. And I do not think that Israel can afford to emerge from this conflict looking weak. The Israelis can't achieve an unconditional victory in the way that Ulysses Grant achieved an unconditional victory, or we did in the Second World War, because our enemies won't grant us an unconditional surrender. But we can and must win an unequivocal victory. 1973, the State of Israel was also punched in the face, caught unawares, made disastrous intelligence judgments, not quite as disastrous as what we saw this month, but disastrous ones. But the war ended with Ariel Sharon's tanks on the other side of the Suez Canal, the Third Army encircled, and Damascus within artillery range of Israeli howitzers. And the Israelis need a victory that looks like that. I'm not a military tactician, but I am assuming that the Israelis, having suffered what they just did, are going to be less stupid than they were in the days preceding the 7th of October. One of the ways in which this attack is so horrific and diabolical is because it leads to a kind of an immediate demoralization and a sense of despair. If Israel could have been hurt so badly by these gangsters, what else does the world have in store for us? But Israel is a powerful country with capable intelligence services, hugely capable military, and a great nation picks itself up even after it's been punched and put to the ground once. And I think the Israelis are going to do that, and I hope they emerge clearly with the utter destruction of Hamas. Great things can follow, not just for Israelis, but also for the region after that happens. But if that doesn't happen, then I do worry about where Israel will wind up in 5 or 10 years.
And not only that, you can't allow a vacuum to be created, because in a place like the Middle East, terror is what actually then takes that vacuum space. So Hamas is not an option, Hezbollah is not an option. Israel has to pay attention to Hamas gaining a foothold in the West Bank, because Fatah is not at all strong and stable. And the last thing you want is Israel to be sandwiched between Hamasistan. That's not a reality Israel can live with.
Let's open it up for a few questions. I think we have time for a couple. And I'm going to remind everyone, if this is your first time at Park Avenue Synagogue, that they are short statements with question marks at the end, and I will cut you off. So is that Barbara, I see? Barbara, please. And I'd ask, in all seriousness, everyone to be disciplined. It's a very emotional night, and keep it to a question.
Good, thank you. Both of you spoke about the importance of educating our kids and the importance of building human capital. How can we get through to the generation born to the gangsters, AKA the people who want to destroy us?
I'm not sure that's your starting place. Yeah. So for me, the starting place is actually those folks who are much more of the don't knows. There's a large swath of don't knows, and the don't knows need to be converted to knows. So that's my starting place, and I'm not worried about those who are the true detractors at this point in time in terms of actually moving the needle, because those individuals aren't interested in any serious, meaningful engagement and learning and education and changing their worldview. So I need to figure out, how do I get to the don't knows? I think it's a combination of efforts, once again, in order to long-term move them and to create that change. And I don't think it begins on college campuses. It starts much earlier, much younger. It starts with family education before these kids are even out of diapers. And we haven't invested in that. We haven't focused on that. So that's where I would say my starting place is, in order to long-term have a meaningful impact.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, behind, right there. Yes, sir.
So I'm not Bill Ackman, but I do make donations to my son's university, but they're not that size. I actually am going to be talking to them tomorrow about a much smaller donation. And I know you said you're not going to give us bullet points, but what should I say? I mean, this is real, this is tomorrow. I mean, what should I say to maybe get them to move the needle?
Do you want to start? You want me to start? You want me to start? First of all, it'd be good for you to know what they did or didn't say.
It's your general nebulous, don't make a commitment letter from the president.
Yeah. And the question is similar to Bret, is that always their policy? Is that not always their policy? You don't have to answer me, right? But if that's always their policy, okay, that's always their policy. There's value to that. But if this is the test case for their neutrality, call it out. Demand to understand why Jews are the test case. Why is it that it's okay to be silent when it comes to dead Jews and terrorism? Let them actually sit there in a very uncomfortable way and answer, or not answer. And it's not just about, in my opinion, making them feel ashamed, which they should and should have a hard time sleeping every single night and not really want to look in the mirror. But it's also about helping them understand that whether they like it or not, they are the grown-ups in the room to these students. And therefore, they have a responsibility to make the hard decisions and do the hard things even when it's unpopular and politically incorrect. This isn't politically incorrect, but it may be unpopular. But they can't expect their students to do the hard work for them when they themselves shy away from it and pass the buck. So in terms of the conversation, my only real suggestion is understand where they're coming from previously, understand how you want to see a difference and have a clear objective or call to action, and ask them if they know what Jew hatred actually is. And do they understand what Jew hatred is without the tiki torches and the swastika on the ground? Because it manifests in a variety of ways, and if they don't understand it, then they need to learn now.
Yeah, I would add, if a simple question, is anti-Zionism anti-Semitism? If they can't answer that question in one word, hey, your son's already in.
Okay. Yeah.
I want to quickly thank the three of you for articulating our collective frustrations and pain. Bret, when you were the interviewee for the 75th anniversary special for SAPIR, you thought it was essential that before anyone talked about any problems with Israel, that you talked about the strength and miracle of Israel, and I listened to it 3 days ago and I wept. How can you make me feel better or modify it or?
Well, I think I just did. And I mean this, you know a lot about a country, whether people are racing for the exits or racing to get back there. And what you're seeing in Israel is everyone here living lives of, Israelis living lives of prosperity, rushing to get back. Look, at least on October 6th, I could have given you a fairly long speech about the profound strengths of Israel vis-a-vis the other countries in the Western world. An astounding demographic growth, the highest economic growth rate in the OECD, in the advanced countries of the world, longevity, social cohesion. One point after another, the country is healthy. And October 7th makes us think, well, none of that is real. Well, all of that remains real. All of that, in fact, remains real. Even when countries are surprised and when their politicians or their intelligence services fall down, it doesn't mean that what we were seeing in Israel on October 6th was a mirage. It wasn't. It is a strong and powerful and resilient country in which political divisions happen not because people despise the country, but because they love it so much. I was very struck by something David Grossman, the great novelist, said during one of the protests. He said, you know, until now, speaking about the protests, even he didn't realize how much he loved Israel. As a leftist and a long-term peace activist, how profoundly committed he was personally and as an artist to the health of that country. It's a country worth fighting for. You know, a statistic that astounds me to this day is that back in March, seems like a bygone era when 700,000 Israelis showed up to protest the judicial reform legislation. 700,000 Israelis is, again, the proportional equivalent of about 25 million Americans. The largest single-day protest in America's history is 5 million, which is was the Women's March in 2017. That's an example not of a country's democracy falling apart. It's an example of a country's democracy coming together, and of people demanding their rights and fighting for their country in an exemplary fashion. By the way, they weren't mostly peaceful protests as we had here in the United States. They were completely peaceful protests. You should feel good about the state of Israel because it remains the one guarantee, despite what happened on October 7th, of Jewish security. We are more vulnerable here on Madison and 87th Street, even now, than they are in Tel Aviv or Jerusalem or anywhere else. Because over there, we have our own people, our own army defending us, not somebody else's.
I want to ask an uncomfortable question, and I need to be careful about it because I agree with everything the two of you have said, I think in its entirety, and I think that the threat of our, whether it's campuses, universities, high schools, otherwise, these are places of intellectual authority. The products of these universities become the future leaders. They're, cultural lightning rods and producers of future leaders. I think our kids are under a real threat. I agree with all of that. But I also wonder to what degree the thing is really the thing. Meaning, I'm on the board of a few Hillels. Some of my best friends are Hillel directors. And when there are outbreaks of this professor, that professor, and I say, how are the kids responding to it? And they say, they're actually fine. It's actually much more on the minds of the parents than it is on the minds of the kids. And I believe that sometimes our concerns about what's going on campus are projections of our own insecurities as the parents of our children. I agree with everything you just said for the last hour, but I'm putting a theory out there. Because if that's the case, then the trauma that is rolling through American Jewry and the concern is an extension of our deep-seated fear, and this goes back to Hanan's opening remarks, that the project of the Enlightenment has been a failure. That try as we might, Jews are not accepted in civic society. And that is what is being played out long before October 7th and on steroids since October 7th. That is the fear in the room. That this promise of America, the acme of which being the universities, access to and graduation from, the ticket to success, this place might just not be as hospitable as we thought it was.
Can I answer very personally?
Sure.
And then hand it to you? September 11th, 2001 was my first day of orientation at Harvard Divinity School. It's a weird place to be at in general, especially as a Jew, oldest graduate institution of the university, where I studied contemporary thought in Judaism and Islam. September 11th, 2001, we don't know what happened. I don't know the majority of students who are in the lecture hall with me for orientation. But the dean walks into the room and says the following: we don't know much. We know that a plane left from Boston. We know that America has been attacked. We can assume it is because of the United States' support of Israel. That was September 11th, 2001. I grew up in a small town in the foothills of the Smoky Mountains, very proud, very small Jewish community. Rabbi Thompson said you had like 1,800 families, yet we had 60. No Jewish education besides the synagogue, which was all lay leaders, no permanent rabbi. So as a kid from that town with a strong Jewish identity, I couldn't believe that at an institution like Harvard, Veritas, etched into every corner of the wall, felt comfortable making a statement like that and actually not having any proof points to substantiate it. Fast forward a few weeks later, the dean, along with some of his friends, start the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement at Harvard and MIT. They take out full-page ads in the Boston Globe, put out statements misquoting UN Resolution 242. They don't actually care about the facts. They have their own ideological and political agenda. Fast forward a few weeks later, I organize a conference on global anti-Semitism in the Arab world. Remember, this was state-sponsored television that had Protocols of the Elders of Zion, resurrection of all of the Mein Kampf happening in the streets. And an individual says, Harvard accepted funds from a government that is promoting anti-Americanism and anti-Semitism. So I want to know more. And I wound up leading a campaign to have Harvard return $2.5 million and seek reputable funding. But I realized, I said, wait a minute. If this is happening at Harvard, it's got to be happening elsewhere. So I follow the money. Remember, I'm a 23-year-old scrubby kid from Tennessee. So I follow the money. Where does it lead me? Columbia, because the same donor gave there. So I meet with students at Columbia. This is 2003. That's the year. And the student said, it's actually really easy to be Jewish. I can wear my kippah. I can actually get kosher food. We have a wonderful Hillel, a wonderful Chabad. The issue is what's happening in the classroom. So we wind up interviewing students, and we create a film called Columbia Unbecoming. My name was Moranos of Morningside Heights. That was not accepted. Why? Because when we interviewed faculty, they wouldn't go on the camera, those who support students around Israel and Zionism. When we interviewed students, some of them wanted to blur their face, mask their voice, which I completely understand. What were these students incurring in the classroom? Joseph Massad, who stood there and said, you, how many Palestinian women did you rape and murder when you served in the IDF? Yep, we are aghast, but guys, it was 2003. Where were we? It's not new. I cannot tell you how serious this is. I want to be clear, not every campus is burning. There are some incredible campuses. There are some incredible leaders. There are some incredible faculty. There are Israel studies programs. There are really good things happening in some places, but the rot is very, very deep. And we turned a blind eye because we said it couldn't be this bad. It is this bad.
And just very briefly to your point, I don't think the problem is that the Enlightenment Project disturbed us. I think the problem is that the Academy turned away from the Enlightenment Project.
That's right.
The Academy turned away from the core liberal values which animated the American Revolution. The Academy turned against America itself. You mentioned Frantz Fanon. I also had to read The Wretched of the Earth at some point.
That's right.
But mockingly. And that's what the Academy bought. It bought Fanon and Said and
Fieri.
And this whole view, right, that made it possible for a totalitarian ethos, 50 years ago a Soviet ethos, later an Islamist ethos, to gain ground and take root in the American Academy. It made possible also cancel culture and the culture of sort of fear and silence throughout American universities. And that doesn't change until you reclaim the higher ground of what it means to believe in core liberal, I mean this in the classical sense, core liberal values, which one university after another has abandoned. I mean, how is it that these schools, it's always at Harvard and Penn and Stanford that you are witnessing this kind of fascistic behavior by students? And it's not just about Israel. Look at what happened at Stanford when a conservative judge showed up to speak. This is what, 6 months ago or so? It's the same kind of impulse. Shout down and bully the people whose views you don't want to hear. And now this is being done, of course, to us. Right. But this is the academy that we created, which is why we have to actually find institutions that are prepared to recommit in an intelligent way. And I don't mean, like right-wing Christian way, but an intelligent way to the kind of education that I was able to get 30 years ago at the University of Chicago. Serious place.
I know, I went there.
Yeah.
I mean, with all due respect to your divinity school.
That's right, that's right.
Friends, if you are uncomfortable, if you are utzed, if you are outraged, if you are filled with sorrow, then let this evening's program prompt you to action, that you should create the sorts of institutions that Bret's describing, that is exemplified by the sacred work of SAPIR, that you should get engaged in the work that Rachel is leading on campuses across the country through Boundless, that you should make your voice heard, that we should empower young men and women in the work of helping them find their voice, and that we should withhold our support from those institutions that do not represent our values. Do not let tonight's conversation just sit. Let tonight's conversation prompt you to action, so we know that when we look back at this moment in history, those of us in the room, those of us online know that we did everything that history called on us to do at this critical moment for the Jewish people. Thank you, everyone, for being here.
Thank you, sir. Always a pleasure.
You rock. You're so
good.
eloquent.
You're good, man.